Hey YouTube, what's up? It's Michael here again. Thanks for joining me. So, over the last 2 weeks, since I posted my last video, I have been reading Brandon Sanderson's Oathbringer. I just finished it the day before yesterday. So instead of doing a book review for just Oathbringer, I figured I'll kind of talk about my thoughts on the series as a whole up to where it is now with Oathbringer. And then when Rhythm of War comes out in a couple months, I'll do a review for that. I'm going to try to keep the spoilers to a minimum, but probably won't be able to keep it entirely spoiler-free. So if you haven't read up through Oathbringer, maybe go and finish that before you watch the video, or unless you just don't care about spoilers. So I picked Brandon Sanderson. I started reading through his bibliography when I got back into reading fantasy a few months back, and I started with Mistborn because I specifically thought that Stormlight Archive was going to be way too big for me to get into. I'm not normally somebody who reads books this big. 600 to 700 pages is like where I like to stick to. Once we start getting into the 4-digit page counts, I start to get really antsy with books normally. And then there's also the fact, like I worked at Barnes & Noble for 2 years and looked at this book and had this book recommended to me a couple of times throughout that time period, but never picked it up because for a couple of really stupid reasons. One, the title I thought was way too generic, The Way of Kings. That sounds really boring, and it's probably just going to be another Lord of the Rings ripoff. And I also had read the back, and it had mentioned something about a war between 10 armies, and I didn't want to try and follow that. That sounded like a lot. Turns out that was not the way the book was written at all. Anyway, so I started with Mistborn and loved it, and then read the first 2 books of Mistborn Era 2, and then just couldn't wait. I needed to pick up Stormlight, so I started there. I will say that the first book, Way of Kings, is probably the one I had the most difficult time getting through, mostly because, like I said, I'm not really I don't do a lot of epic fantasy on this scale, so I'm not really used to how slow it can be in terms of big events happening. So this entire time, while reading this book, I was waiting for Kaladin to stop being a slave and to escape. I was like, because it starts off really cool with with the prelude with the heralds, and that's cool. And then it starts immediately with Kaladin at war, and then he's a slave. And I was like, okay, cool. So he's gonna be a slave for the first quarter of the book, and then he's gonna escape and go become some kind of cool warrior. And then he doesn't for the entire book until the end. He's still a slave, and that. I guess it was just an issue with my expectations, but Jesus Christ, I was really impatient. I was like, what the fuck, bro? Why are you still a slave? Let's move on, please. So for that specific reason, and that reason almost only, the first book was the most difficult for me to get through. One of the other issues I had with it is actually really not an issue, and is more of just a negative consequence of one of Brandon's writing strengths, and that is his characters are way too relatable, specifically Kaladin. He is writing Kaladin's depression in a way that is very similar to my own. So I go through these phases of being really depressed and in the dumps and not wanting to do anything and hating myself and curling up in a ball and wallowing. And then I go through other phases of, everything's important and I'm determined and I'm going to do some amazing things and I'm working really hard. And so it's just this really weird experience to be reading Kaladin's story, and then when he goes into one of his depressive swings and starts to hate himself, it's like the exact same feeling that I have, and so it is a little bit difficult for me to not hate Kaladin in the same way that I hate myself when I'm in those phases. A little bit of a long ramble to say that I relate to Kaladin way too much, and Brandon did way too good of a job writing his depression and the issues that he struggles with, to the point where I want to call Kaladin my favorite character because I do relate to him so much. It's scary how similar I feel to him as a character, but because of that, it also makes it really difficult for me to call him my favorite because he has those parts of myself that I hate. So anyway, the other characters also all have that same, at least the main characters, that same level of depth. Shallan, Dalinar, Adolin. Apparently I pronounced Adolin wrong, but I don't care, because Adolin sounds weird to me. I love them all. They're all fantastic. Shallan probably gets on my nerves the most. But not in a way that I dislike as a character. I just kind of, I don't know. I find myself frustrated by her struggles. I guess I don't know. It's hard to describe, but and it's not every time she's the focus or anytime the book follows her, I'm frustrated. Usually I'm not. I actually love her parts of the books normally, but if I'm going to be frustrated by somebody's section, it's either going to be hers or Kaladin's for different reasons. But aside from that, one of the things that I have loved the most while reading these books is the world building. Now, I've heard from a lot of people that they think Sanderson's kind of, at least so far, because obviously there's 7 more books to read, at least so far, people have felt like the world building has been somewhat lackluster in terms of the history of the world. And like, I see what they're saying, because, you know, like everybody says, there's been 4,500 years since the last desolation, and we really don't know a whole lot about what's happened since then. We know about Sadie's the Sunmaker and the empire he did, and you know, a couple of small events here and there, but not much else. And you know, that's true, I guess, but it doesn't really bother me, because personally, one of my favorite parts of world building is the mythology and the kind of like the divine setup and the way everything works in terms of the deities and the gods. And that seems to be one of Sanderson's favorite aspects of fantasy worlds as well, because he really digs into that in most of his books, and in the Cosmere as a whole. And Stormlight Archive, I haven't read all of the Cosmere yet. I've read Mistborn Era 1 and 2 and now Stormlight, so I don't have a lot of experience with the Cosmere yet. And the amount of information I'm getting from Stormlight Archive about the Cosmere as a whole is incredibly exciting, and like makes, especially in Oathbringer, the amount of information revealed about like Voidbinders and Odium and all. Like I said, sorry, I really kind of gave up on avoiding spoilers, but like the amount of little tidbits and teases he gave in Oathbringer about the wider setup of you know, how investiture works on this world, and the general system with what are the other worlds? Something with the B and Ashen, the other, you know, Damnation and the Tranquilin Halls. Basically, like, that stuff is incredibly intriguing, and I need to know more. And like, I'm really excited for Rhythm of War, so I can start to learn more about those things. I'm kind of struggling with what to talk about, because I don't want to make a 30-minute ramble. But I also don't want to just like talk about every single spoiler thing in the book that catches my attention. So I guess I'll just try and sum up my thoughts here with Stormlight. I think is, if you're not somebody who's read large-scale epic fantasy before, I think Stormlight Archive is probably the perfect introduction to it, because Brandon's writing is so clear and precise. I think people like to use the word approachable for him, and I think that's very true. He is very approachable, but I think that is specifically because his writing is precise. He writes exactly what he wants you to know, nothing more, nothing less. And that I can really appreciate. It does leave his writing a little bit simplistic, as some people have called, but I don't think his stories themselves are simplistic. The sheer readability of Stormlight makes it probably the best introduction to large-scale epic fantasy. After having read these, I feel a little bit more comfortable trying to do something like Wheel of Time, which is an ungodly amount of time to invest into a book series. But like, I want to now that I know that I can read multiple thousand-page books with the same characters and still be interested. You know, it's worth a shot. I don't know if I can read 15 worth, but it's worth a shot, basically. So yeah, definitely recommend Stormlight Archive. Don't have much else to say, so thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. You know all the stuff. I appreciate it.